Hey everyone, this is DKeys, wanting to give you a quick update on what my thoughts are about the upcoming balance patch. I know a lot of people have been all doom and gloom for Ellies because the changes that we get don't seem as spectacular as those, say, as for Guardian or Thief or Warrior, but we actually have a lot to look forward to and can expect a few buffs out of this patch. With the upcoming Specialization patch, the UI that you'll see when you go to swap traits or skills will change quite a bit. Instead of having your skills on one panel and your specializations or your traits on another, you'll have all of it available in one panel, making it easier for you to, say, swap out a skill and then throw in a trait that corresponds to that skill, such as Frostbow and Tempest Defense, in the middle of a dungeon. Now, instead of being able to distribute 7 points along 5 trait lines as it is now, you'll only have 3 tracks to put your points in, but you'll be able to max out those tracks. Shown here, we have a concept art from ANET of the air, fire, and water trees. So in fire, we have similar minor traits as we do right now. The adept level minor changes a little bit, granting the Elementalist a fire shield when they swap to fire attunement. This really won't play a big role for a lot of the builds that we use in PvE, but it could be useful for a aura share build so that you and your party mates can benefit from that fire aura. Sunspot remains unchanged at the master level, where you will inflict a little bit of damage to enemies around you when you swap to fire attunement, and similarly, Burning Rage remains unchanged as a 10% damage increase to burning foes. At the Adept level, Burning Precision absorbs 2 traits. First of all, Burning Precision, which is a chance to inflict burning on your target when struck, and also an additional Adept level major trait that increases burning duration. Conjurer also maintains its Conjurer properties, but also you will gain a fire aura when an ally picks up a Conjurer weapon or when you use a signet. This probably won't really play into aura share builds because those are typically dagger centric, but it could be another useful way to get a fire shield for you or your party. And then finally, we have a 7% conversion from power to condition damage. Now that means you don't lose any power, just you gain that percent of your power towards condition damage. Since Elementalist doesn't really have a very strong condition aspect in PvE, I don't expect this to be very important either. At the Master's level, Pyromancer's Training absorbs 2 traits that are pretty central to a couple of builds already in PvE, taking the 10% damage increase while on fire, and taking the 20% recharge reduction on fire skills. So you'll see this being central to staff Ellie builds, which are still very strong after this patch. One with fire not only extends the duration of fire auras, which will allow you to gain might if you happen to be struck, but also will allow that fire aura to grant might once it's initially applied. So that could potentially be useful in aura share builds, but I don't know if that would edge out, say, air or earth for the protection. Finally, Burning Fire, it takes a few of the remaining traits that haven't been absorbed so far and groups them into one. First of all, cantrips grant you might when used, so if you're using a cantrip build for some odd reason, then this could be a trait that you use. And additionally, you will use Cleansing Fire when you have a number of conditions on you. Now, since this shares the same slot as Pyromancer's Training, I don't know if you'll want to take this because sacrificing Pyromancer's Training could be a significant DPS loss for your rotation. At the Grandmaster level, the fire traits really don't see much of a change. Persisting Flames gets the additional effect of the Elementalist creating a lava font if they're downed in battle, which could be pretty useful to help you rally, especially if an enemy is close to dying already. Pyromancer's Puissance remains the same, granting might when you cast a fire spell. And finally, Blinding Ashes still blinds foes when you apply burning to them. Air sees quite a bit of a switch up in the ordering of traits. So the miners remain just about the same. Zephyr speed, movement speed increase when attuned to air of just a little bit. Electric discharge is a strike of lightning on your target when you swap into air. And a weak spot is Vol non-crit. At the Adept level, Zephyr's Boon remains unchanged for those aura builds, and One with Air also remains unchanged, which is a little underwhelming considering some of the other cool changes they've been doing to other traits. And Ferocious Winds is a percent convert from healing power to ferocity. Now, I'm not sure if this will have a place in PvE because they'll also be changing how attributes are given out. So if we actually have a non-zero base healing power, this could potentially be useful. But if it remains a zero base, with Assassins or Berserker gear, you're not going to be getting any healing power, so we'll probably skip over this trait. At the Master level, Inscription is a combination of the glyphs traits that are already in the airline. So not only will you get a boon when you cast a glyph in a particular attunement, you'll also have that recharge reduction on those glyphs, which has become pretty popular recently with the Glyph of Storms buff that can allow an Elementalist to really burst some vuln. Aeromancer's training is kind of a combination of air training and arcane lightning as it stands now, but you only get that 150 ferocity while in air attunement. So that means this really narrows down the application of it to different builds. And of course you have the 20% recharge reduction on air skills. So it's, instead of being say a 10% modifier, it is much more like a 3 to 5% depending on how ferocity changes and base ferocity ends up converting into crit damage. Finally, Tempest Defense is knocked down to the Master level tier. Now, since there's going to be the break bars added to PvE, that means you may not be frostbowing bosses in lower level dungeons so that you can quickly burst them down. So maybe after all of those changes, this is the appropriate spot for Tempest Defense, just because it'll be a lot harder to disable bosses for an extended period of time. But also there's an aura here in case you happen to be disabled while in combat. So they're definitely trying to increase the viability of aura builds for party applications, but I don't think the damage is there just yet. And finally in the Grandmaster, we have Bolt to the Heart, which got jumped up from the Adepts tier. Now, currently it says a 20% damage increase while at 33% health or less, or while your foe is at 33% health or less. But I think if the Thief and Necromancer trait lines are anything to go off, this might possibly be bumped up to a 50% health threshold, which would make this a pretty strong damage modifier. However, this damage modifier fights with fresh air, which is pretty central to the dagger focus build. And finally, Lightning Rod remains more or less unchanged, and I don't really see this used in PvE all that often. Earth really lost a lot of its damage modifiers in this version of the Specialization update. In fact, the one damage modifier that we got from minor traits at the Grandmaster level has turned into a damage reduction when within 600 range of your target. Now I know the devs wanted to make a defensive spec more stronger with this update, but this really hurts the ability of the Earth trait line to help with DPS builds. At the Adept level, we have Earth's Embrace, which will grant Armor of Earth when your health is below the threshold. Now 25% is pretty low, so I don't think the prot that Armor of Earth would give you would save you at under 25% health. Serrated Stone is a damage modifier of 5% against bleeding foes, which is what it is right now, as well as an increase in bleeding duration. And finally, Elemental Shielding remains the same, granting prot when you apply an aura. At the Master level, you have Strength of Stone, which will convert some of your toughness to condition damage, and Rock Solid, which will grant stability to nearby allies when attuning to Earth, which is the same as it is right now. Then finally, Geomancer's training helps you recover from cripple, immobilize, and other CCs faster, and also helps reduce the recharge on your skills, which is a combination of a couple of traits already in existence. And finally, the Earth Grandmaster traits really have not been touched at all. Now, they're all pretty unique, so I didn't really expect them to touch them. But again, this is a very defensive trait line now, so I don't think you'll see this used in a lot of organized groups for PvE. Since the water traits were revealed in the dev post, we don't have pretty graphics for those. But again, besides some reordering of things, water remains relatively unchanged. But since it still has a good number of damage modifiers, you'll probably spec into this instead of Earth for your DPS builds. Your minor traits, you grant regen when or not quite regen, you grant an effect similar to regen when you're attuned to water. And at the master level, you'll heal nearby allies when attuning to water. So since you're taking the water trait lines, especially for lightning hammer builds, you'll help your party keep that Scholar's buff. Aquatic Benevolence will boost that just a little bit more. Currently, I believe Aquatic Benevolence is a Grandmaster major trait, so bumping it down means you don't really have a choice in the matter. But it means that something else got buffed so that we have a very powerful Grandmaster trait for DPS builds. And at the Adept level, we have Soothing Ice, which grants regeneration and Frost Aura when you are struck by a critical hit. Again, possibly useful for an aura build, but nothing to write home about. And then Piercing Shards, which is while attuned to water, your spells deal 20% more damage to vulnerable foes. It's currently very popular for water builds because that 20% is so strong. Additionally, this has good synergy with the air trait line because the vulnerability you'll be applying will last a little bit longer. Then finally, Stop, Drop, and Roll, which I believe is master level right now, gets bumped down to the Adept tier. At the master level, we have Soothing Disruption, which buffs cantrip's ability a little bit more to go along with the one trait in the fire line. And Cleansing Wave, which will remove a condition from you and your allies when you attune to water, which already exists at the master tier, I believe. Finally, Aquamancer's Training will allow you to do 10% more damage when your health is above the threshold. This is currently a trait at the Adept level, and they're bumping it up so that this damage modifier doesn't conflict with the damage modifier from Piercing Shards. Then additionally, like all the other training traits that we have, it reduces the recharge on water weapon skills. At the Grandmaster Major level, we have Cleansing Water, which will remove a condition when you grant regen to an ally or yourself, and Powerful Aura, which will allow you to share your auras with allies. Finally, they bumped Bountiful Power from a minor trait to a major trait, and I think they will change that damage modifier from a 1% to a 2%. So that way we have a damage modifier at the Adept, Master, and Grandmaster tier in the water trait line to take. The Arcane trait line saw a lot of rearrangement and merging as well. So for the minor traits, we have Arcane Fury, which still gives Fury on attunement swap, Lingering Elements, which allows the bonuses you get from the Adept level minor traits to linger for a little bit longer once you get out of an element, and Arcane Precision to give your spells a chance to apply a condition on a critical hit. Nothing to write home about. At the Adept level, Arcane Energy allows your arcane skills to grant endurance on use, and also reduces the recharge on those arcane skills. Renewing Stamina doesn't really change from what it is right now, so if you need permanent vigor, this would be the trait you take, even though it's in a trait line that really doesn't have any damage modifiers whatsoever now. And finally, Arcane Abatement is a damage reduction for falling damage. This used to be in the water trait line. At the master level, you have all of your res, modifiers in one trait now under Arcane Resurrection. And Elemental Contingency, which I know exists right now, will grant yourself a boon when you are struck, based on your attunement. Now in PvE, you certainly don't want to be hit all that often, so I don't think this will be very useful. Finally, Final Shielding will give you an Arcane Shield when your health is below 25%. And at the Grandmaster level, Evasive Arcana, which is popular for some dagger builds, is still at the Grandmaster level, but it fights with Elemental Attunement, which will grant you and nearby allies a boon when you attunement swap. And finally, Elemental Surge gives your arcane skills a chance to inflict a condition when you hit an enemy. I expect PvE builds to be focused on the fire, air, and water trait lines because they have the most damage modifiers. For example, for the Staff Elementalist, Burning Precision would be nice to keep burning on your enemies so you keep that 10% damage modifier as your Grandmaster Minor. For the Master level, the major trait's a no-brainer. Pyromancer's Training will keep your Lava Font uptime very high and also increase your damage. Now, longer will you have to pick between Fire 6 and Fire 7 to see what you can do the best with if your group's not exactly ideal. And then of course, at the Grandmaster level, you take Persisting Flames as usual. In air, Zephyr's Boon might be useful, especially if you sneak in a Magnetic Aura while in Earth Attunement, and Tempest Defense might be useful at the Master level if you can maintain a high uptime of disables on a boss. If not, there are options for these two. Of course, for the Grandmaster, Bolt to the Heart is another big damage modifier. And then in water, Piercing Shards, while you won't spend a lot of time in water attunement, will help keep your Vuln high from the Grandmaster Minor trait in air. From the Master trait, Aquamancer's Training is another 10% damage modifier, and then Bountiful Power is yet another damage modifier. Some options in air if you don't want to use Tempest Defense are Ferocious Winds, depending on if you actually have any healing power in your build, and of course Inscription for that recharge reduction on Glyph of Storms. Looking at the math, now Staff Elementalist is about a 1.3 to 1.46 modifier depending on your build. You have your 2 damage modifiers in fire, a couple in air that are a little bit lower, and of course Tempest Defense, and you either pick Blasting Staff by going 2 into Arcane, or another 10% damage modifier either from Earth or Water. After this patch, you'll be getting Blasting Staff for free, freeing up those trait points to go into a different line for even more damage modifiers. Again, I'm not sure if Bolt to the Heart will stay at only 6% or if it will be buffed because it's now a Grandmaster trait, so you'll be looking at about 1.5 or even higher damage modifier. So Staff Elementalists are getting a huge buff with this patch. Scepter Hammer Elementalists also get a little bit of a buff in this patch, but not as much. In fire, I would recommend Conjurer, or if you are in very short fights, you can swap this out for Burning Precision. Pyromancer's Training, of course, for the increased damage while in fire, plus also more fire fields. And of course Persisting Flames, so that your blast finishers grant Fury. In air, again Zephyr's Boon could be useful because you'll have access to a few auras, though you can also swap that out for Ferocious Winds if that happens to be a thing. Same with Tempest Defense versus Glyph cooldowns. And of course Bolt to the Heart again because I expect this damage modifier to be very strong. And in water, you'll be taking the same traits as well. Piercing Shards for the Vuln and also for the damage modifier, as I expect the water camping rotations to become stronger with these kinds of builds. Aquamancer's Training for that 10% Scholars bonus, and Bountiful Power. So looking at Scepter Hammer builds now and after patch, Internal Fire and Air Training keep up about a 10% damage modifier almost all the time, and then you have a few other damage modifiers on top of that from Fire, Air, and Earth, giving you about a 1.46 modifier. After the balance patch, you'll be spending a lot of time in fire and water, so you'll have a little bit more than a 10% damage modifier on average from those two. And then you multiply that by Burning Rage, Aquamancer's Training, and a few other traits for about a 1.56 modifier. Now this will be a little bit more variable because you also have to swap to Earth for blast finishers, or you may want to swap to air for, say, Swirling Winds if you're a Scepter Focus Elementalist. Dagger Focus Elementalists don't quite fare as well because their Grandmaster trait, Fresh Air, takes up that same spot that Bolt to the Heart does. So again, in Fire, Burning Precision for the burning uptime, especially since burning's probably going to be a stacking condition as opposed to duration only. Pyromancer's Training for more fire fields, and Persisting Flames for the damage and the fury. Zephyr's Boon and Air for the auras granting fury and swiftness. Again, the swiftness can help while soloing as well, so you can move in and out of AoEs a little bit more easily. And of course, Aeromancer's Training for the recharge reduction on air skills, also useful if you need high swirling one's uptime, and that slight damage boost from that 150 ferocity. Then finally, you need fresh air so you can maintain a good rotation. In water, you have the same traits as usual, Piercing Shards for the Vuln, Aquamancer's Training for the damage modifier, as well as Bountiful Power. Now the math for this shows that Dagger Focus will probably be getting weaker with this balance patch. Again, you'll have a 10% damage modifier from fire, but when you swap to air, instead of having a 10% damage modifier, you'll have only about a 3 to 5% damage modifier, depending on what they do with ferocity. So you're losing quite a few percent of your damage there. Also, you have, instead of Stone Splinters, Bountiful Power, so you're losing a little bit more there. So overall, you're going from about a 1.4 damage modifier to 1.37. It's a little bit weaker, but ANET might do something to our skills to help make up that damage buff. Otherwise, Staff Elementalist will be pretty much on top for PvE Elementalists after this balance patch. Scepter Hammer Elementalists will be a little bit up in the air, especially since they hinted they might be nerfing Lightning Hammer as well as Frostbow. And Dagger Focus, even though it received a buff recently, will be sliding back down in its DPS, though it could still be pretty viable for some soloing. Of course, you'll be sacking a whole lot more power if you trait into Arcana for the Vigor and the Endurance regen, as opposed to Water. So that's it for now for the PvE Elementalist in regards to this specialization patch. I'm keeping on top of this information, and I hope to have a lot of these traits into the current build calculator that I'm working on so that I can give you better numbers in the near future, especially when we know what's going to change about attribute points and what's going to change about Lightning Hammer and Frostbow and maybe any other Elementalist skills. And of course, I'm looking forward to the Elite Specialization that will be released with the expansion. Thanks for watching, everyone.